You were just watching the sentencing hearing for the Oxford High School shooter.
That's right. You've been following everything since the Miller hearing leading up to this very moment. Judge Rowe's sentencing coming down at 4 o'clock precisely this afternoon. Today, victims gave powerful and emotional statements about that shooting and how it has forever changed their lives.
But before we get to some of those statements, we like to get to our guests to talk about what just happened in court today. Joining us now are attorneys Terry Johnson and Sanford Schulman. Thank you both, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you.
So Terry, we've been watching this, like we said, from the Miller hearing. That was many months ago. Now we see life without the possibility of parole is what was decided today.
Yes. Judge Rowe did an excellent job in listening to all of the evidence. Whether I agree or disagree is not the issue. I believe that, as we go through this again, this is probably what the family wanted, and I think the downside to this is, we heard from the defendant at the end of this, and even the judge said, the judge clearly said he didn't ask for a life with a term of years. I'm not sure why at that point he got up and spoke. That was kind of surprising, but I don't know that even changed the judge's mind. I think it just added fuel to the fire of what the judge wanted to do. He had made his mind up at that point. So.
Yeah, it was definitely surprising to hear him speaking, and also the things he said. He said, I'm a terrible person, I've done terrible things, and I've lied, I'm not trustworthy. He also said whatever decision is handed down is what he wants to go with. And how are you feeling about what we heard, especially from that shooter?
Well, I was surprised by a couple of things. First of all, the defendant spoke without notes. He was very articulate in terms of his words and his words choice. I wasn't sure how well he was prepared, given that he sort of had conceded that if the court imposes such a sentence, he's okay with it. But I think that what was a little bit illusory was that the court gave the defense the feeling that they could argue for a sentence of less than mandatory life in prison. But the judge had previously already found that there's no chance of reconciliation. They could be rehabilitation. They can't be rehabilitated. So the defense, I thought, did a great job at the very end saying, there's no record. And we have juvenile lifers, and I represented several in the last couple of months, who would come to court and say, that is not the same person 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago that is here in the court today. And I thought that's what the defense was really arguing, that in 20, 30, 40 years, he will have a chance at parole. Not a guarantee, but a chance, and he'll have 40 years to prove it. Here he had less than 2 years, maybe even less than that to prove it, and his statements didn't really help. They weren't extremely emotional, they weren't extremely empathetic, but in the end, I think the court had already decided it, and the defense was basically saying, speak if you want to, but it's probably not going to help.
Yeah, Terry, something else that shooter said, all I want is for the people I've hurt to feel like justice has been served. A sharp contrast from what we heard in those notes during the Miller hearing, where he was saying he wanted them to be hurt, wanted to see the pain on their faces.
Well, again, I think you go back to what the defense attorney talked about in this was that's not the same person, right? We talk about the fact that he has, over the past a little over 2 years, been getting some mental health treatment. He has been on his medication. So what was written then versus what's now, and I would agree, he's a different person. We see a step in that direction. We saw, or we heard the prosecution strike that. We heard the defense say that he did allocute. He did come forward not to cause any more pain and say, I'm guilty of this. He pled guilty. He stood up. He took responsibility. That shows me that there could potentially be rehabilitation down the road, but obviously that's not what's going to happen in this case.
And Sanford, you have extensive experience with Miller hearings in particular. As you mentioned, you just had a few in the last couple months. And this Miller hearing, we covered it extensively. How is this one different than the ones that you've overseen?
What I was surprised by is that the judge had already made a decision on whether he could be rehabilitated. But he hadn't heard any of this today, and he hadn't heard the defendant speak. He had already made his mind up at that Miller hearing. Once he made that decision, he cannot, the way I look at it, he cannot find a number of years. He can't find that because that's what Miller says. You must find that someone can be rehabilitated before you can decide whether there should be a set number of years. I think another thing that surprised me about his statement of the defendant today is that he didn't appear as a child. When you do the juvenile lifers and you see these guys come back there 40, 50 years and they're so grown up and they're so matured and they have such a different outlook in life. But I was surprised. He seemed very adult-like in his word choice and the way he conducted himself. I think he would have done himself better, maybe not to speak, but if he looked as if he was a child, a 15-year-old, I think the judge may have looked at him differently. But that's not how he appeared today.
Are you at all surprised by the decision we heard?
No, when I was here at the end of the Miller, I was surprised there was even a sentencing like this. I thought that certainly the victims have a right to speak. That is sentencing. So if someone's convicted of first-degree murder and they're an adult, you have a hearing like this. And the victims will speak, but the judge has mandated mandatory life. In this case, I just assumed it was going to be a mandatory life without parole. The idea that the court gave the defense the idea that he could be choosing something differently after he ruled in the Miller hearing he could not be rehabilitated was, in my opinion, illusory. But in the end, the judge was consistent with what he said in Miller, mandatory life sentence. All he has left, I hope, is that the laws will change and that someday some of Congress, president will decide that children should not spend their entire life in prison.
Well, Terry and Sanford, thank you so much for joining us today
Thank you.
and helping
Thank you.
us
It's been a
break
pleasure.
this down.
And we have continued coverage of this situation for you. We have to take a quick break, but we will be right back after this. You're watching CBS News Detroit at 4.